Well, good morning, welcome. It's Friday the 10th of April and I've got quite an exciting study to bring you this morning. I'm actually quite hyped up about this. It's a bit of encouraging news. Now, before we start this, you need to know a little bit of background science. You'll remember that the antigen is the virus. The antibody is the immune protein that your body makes in response to the virus. And this study is from Germany, looking at the antibodies. Now, I'm going to give you a bit more science later on if you want some, so stick around if you want more science. But this is a remarkably encouraging study I've got this morning. So these are the references for it. Now, just a slight proviso here. These are from English news reports, from authoritative sources. But the actual paper in German, I can't find an English translation of it yet, because I always like to go to the original source written by the scientists, but with no reason to suspect that this is suspect in any way. And when we get the English translation, it will bear this out, I have no doubt. Now, this is a study in Germany on the prevalence of the antibodies in a community. Now, Gangelt in Heisberg was the area, that was the town, that's the area in Germany. It's in the west of Germany, it's just near the Netherlands border from what I remember. This was a bit of an epicenter and where a lot of infection started off at in Germany. So there's quite a high infection rate there. So that's why they studied this. And this is the first study of this nature to be published. Now, there are a couple of others coming up. Yesterday, we looked at that town in Italy near Rome that was completely cordoned off, of nearly 2,000 people, where everyone is being tested. So we'll get precise numbers of how many people have actually contracted the virus. And we also looked yesterday at a study of 800 people that have been randomly selected in the United Kingdom, and the samples have been sent to Porton Down Laboratory for very accurate analysis of the antibodies to give us an indication of the prevalence of infection. So prevalence means how many people are infected. Well, prevalence means that the number in the community. So there could be people actively infected or people that have had it. So the overall prevalence would give us the number of people that have had the disease as well as the number of people that have it. And that will give us the total number, because at the moment we actually don't know that. But just to give you the bottom line on this study in Germany, it looks like the numbers are higher than we thought. And that's got some interesting and basically good implications. So first European study, but as I say, a couple more coming out, and I would expect the Italian study and the British study to be consistent with this, and I have quite a few reasons for this. Quite a few reasons for believing that the infection rate is actually way higher than the official testing figures have shown. Partly that's because we don't have enough testing, we already know that. But partly, and this is quite sobering really, in my area and in many areas around the country and around the world indeed, this is substantiated from around the world, that more people are dying. There's more burials than we would expect for the time of year. That indicates that if people are dying, they've already become infected some weeks ago, and they were incubating that some weeks before that. So it means that there's been more disease around in more communities than we think. And this paper gives us fairly scientific evidence for that. Now, these tested for antibodies as well as signs of current infection. So they wanted to know who was currently infected and who'd had the disease. And I think these researchers were probably as excited as me, because normally you wouldn't publish these until you'd done all the study, and they've only done half the study. And I think they had ants in the pants and needed to report this, just the same as I've got seem to have a need to report it to you, because it seems to be good news. So what they found was, in this town, in this area in Germany, this population, they looked at 1,000 people, 400 households. So 1,000 people is a good size sample. You can get good data from 1,000 people. That is very reasonable research methodology. And they found that 2% were currently infected. Presumably they diagnosed that with the antigen test. But they found that 14% of the population had antibodies. In other words, there was evidence in 16% of the population altogether, 2 plus 14, that the virus had infected 16% of the population. So many more people had had the virus than knew they had had it and were assumed to have had the virus. And one application of this jumps out straight away, and I think most of you understand this. But if we think about the case fatality rates, so if there's 10 deaths in 100 people that are infected, I think you can probably see that 10 is 10% of the 100. So 10 deaths, 100 people infected, that would give us a case fatality rate of 10%, CFR 10%. But if there was 10 deaths, but 1,000 people were infected, then I think most of you will see that gives us a case fatality rate of only 1%. So the larger number of people that are infected compared to deaths, the lower the case fatality rate is. And we have been seeing some terrifying case fatality rates in Italy and Spain, Germany, France, my country, absolutely terrifying case fatality rates. But it looks like the case fatality is grossly overestimated because we are underestimating the amount of people that are infected. So this is remarkably encouraging news, and this looks like it's starting to pan out now. So the 15% now have immunity. Now, the previous estimates in this town were 5%. So it means the number of people immune or believed to have immunity because they have this antibody are 3 times higher than was previously believed. And this gives rise to the idea of herd immunity. Now, for herd immunity to be there, we need about 60 to 70% of the population to be immune. So what herd immunity is, you probably know this, but if there's like an infected person there, then that infected person can only infect uninfected people. But if you have people round about him that have already been infected and have the antibodies, then he can't pass it on, or she can't pass it on to those people round about him. And that means uninfected people in the wider community are not going to get transmitted from him to her or her to him. So it kind of breaks that chain of transmission. So 60% of people are immune, then we get good herd immunity. And this indicates that we're on about 15% herd immunity now. So this is encouraging. Now 15% herd immunity, at 15% the virus will still spread, of course. It's not 60 or 70% to stop spread. But even this will slow down the rate of spread, as an infected person has a 15% chance of coming into contact with someone who is already immune to the virus. So the infected person there, 15% likely to meet one of those instead of meeting one of those. So that's going to reduce the R0. That's going to reduce the rate of infection. Now, to be fair, this is in this particular population, in this particular town. So in science, we always know about the risk of extrapolation. So extrapolation is like carrying on the graph, taking a little bit of data and saying, well, because this applies to me, it applies to everyone. That's irrational. But the authors of this study do say there's cause for cautious optimism. In other words, they're believing that the amount of infected people in other areas of Germany who have been infected and have made the antibodies is higher than was believed. We can't know till we test all the population of Germany or all the population of anywhere. But this is a very promising indication that 15% might be infected. And we have said this for some time. I mean, weeks ago, the British Chief Medical Officer was saying the real number of cases in the UK are probably 10 times or 20 times higher than is detected by the antigen testing because of the lack of antigen testing. So this is very encouraging. Now, what this does, if we do extrapolate this data a bit, is in Germany, this will give us a case fatality rate of about 0.37%. Now, currently, the Johns Hopkins case fatality rate is 1.98%, which is frighteningly high. That's almost 2% of the population. So while this is still bad, it's 0.37. So it's a lot lower than the figures that we have been getting. So this is encouraging. So this means roughly about 1 in 300 people could die who get infected. It's better than it was. It's encouraging news. And the author studies, one of the lead scientists, the much lower mortality rate in Gangelt is explained by the fact this study is detecting all infected people, including this is my words, but it's what he meant, asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic people. In other words, it's detecting people who had no symptoms. Now, it may well be that up to 50% of people who get this COVID-19 infection have no symptoms at all. This is what we're starting to find out now. Or this study also detected people who were minimally symptomatic. So people who thought they might have had it or just fell off for a couple of days, or maybe just had a cough that resolved. So that included those people as well. So it's giving us a much clearer picture. And other studies, we mentioned the one in my country, the one in Italy. The Chinese have been doing similar studies, studying antibodies, who has had the disease, where the disease has been, so we can get the real prevalence of the disease. And slightly concerningly, the Chinese found it difficult to detect antibodies in 6% of the population. So this means that maybe 6% of people who are infected are having a poor immunological response in terms of making the antibodies. Now, whether that's just that the Chinese test is not sufficiently sophisticated yet to pick these up, or whether that poor level of antibody response in 6% of people who have been infected is an indication that they could potentially be reinfected, it's really too early to tell. So we don't know what the implications is for immunity in this. But the virologists and other scientists who've studied this for a while say that based on the characteristics of the virus, now they stress they don't know how long immunity is going to last. They don't know that. No one knows that. We can't know that. That's in the future. But based on the type of virus, they estimate it's probably going to be 18 months. So it looks like when people have had this virus, they could be immune for 18 months. And that's good because that gives us time to get a vaccine. So this is encouraging. Now, it could be less than 18 months. It could be as little as a few months. I suspect it won't be. I suspect this is nearer the mark. It could be much more, of course. It could potentially be decades. But 18 months is probably the working estimate at the moment. But that's okay because that gives us time to get the vaccine. That is enough. That is enough time. And one of the lead authors said, I think the most important thing all governments can do is to address the virus, is to get more reliable data. So to address this problem, we need more reliable data. This means we need lots and lots of testing. The disappointing thing is, in my country, the antibody tests probably aren't going to be with us until May. Another month away. Now, the antibody tests that we did buy in this country, apparently they're only about 70% effective, so they're just not very useful at all. But once this comes on, and the Italian data and the British data, and I know we're doing these antibody tests in Porton Down, but they're quite clever there. That's a sophisticated laboratory setup. What we need is a quick, easy blood test. The South Koreans seem to be doing quite well on this, but other places are a bit behind. But when we get this, and we will get this, scientists are working on this, this will get better, then this is going to give us a major weapon against the virus. In fact, this is going to be one of the main ways out of lockdown. So I would predict that this lockdown is not going to last because we're going to test our way out of it in most countries. And that means that we can get into a phase where we're isolating vulnerable groups, yes. Now, this is controversial. What the Germans plan on doing is issuing immunity certificates. So someone who has proved to have the antibody would be given a certificate. And that means, assuming they have immunity, which we believe they're going to have, they could be discharged from quarantine, discharged from isolation, and return to normal duties. Because if they're immune, they can't contract the virus, and they can't pass the virus on to someone else. So this is good because this is going to give us a bit of a workforce. People that can work without risk of spreading the virus. And the German government is planning to do batches of 100,000. And they're planning to issue certification. And I assume the first 100,000 are going to be key workers who can then be adjudicated as immune. So that's interesting. Now, Yeah, I think I'll just carry on one more thing today. I'm going to do this. I'll do a separate one on the science. I was going to show you some diagrams from a physiology book, but I'll just put that up as a teaser for the. We'll do it in the next video or two. Now, I found this data based on Oxford University, and again, of course, I'll give you the link so you can check it for yourself in case I'm making this up. You know, there's been so much disinformation. You always have to go back to the source, and all I can tell you is that I am giving you the facts as I interpret the data. Now, to be fair, as an academic, I've been interpreting data for a long time. That's been my job for a long time as a research academic. But I can still get it wrong. So you always have to go back to the original data. But I give you my word, I'm giving it to you as honestly as I can interpret it, but I'm not infallible, of course. So the original sources are always important. Now, this is from Oxford University, who are collecting some really good data, actually, some impressive data. And I'll give you it's One World in Data. I'll give you the link for that. So click on that. It's a fascinating site. And this data is now 2 days old. I collected it yesterday. But it's very interesting. And it gives us the number of, so like South Korea is doing 9 tests per 1,000 people. And that results in just under 500,000 tests for their population. So this is the amount of tests conducted per head of the population in a country. And interestingly, we see South Korea is doing well, but it's not top of the pile. Other countries are doing slightly more, and yet the South Koreans have been very successful in curtailing this epidemic, the epidemic in their country, the corner of the pandemic in their country. So these testing must be well targeted in South Korea. They're doing a very good job in South Korea, despite relatively small amounts of testing. Let's hope they share all their secrets with us, and it looks like they are. Now, just to give other examples, Bahrain, small, rich country, so as you would expect, testing is fairly good, 31 per 1,000, but a small population. So they've done 52,804 tests, which indicates the smaller size of the population in Bahrain. Now, Canada doing fairly well, 9.55 per 1,000 people, that many tests in total, so that's reasonably encouraging. And of course, these tests at the moment are nearly all the antigen tests, not the antibody tests. This is people who have the infection now that are being tested. Now, the US, from a terrible start, is up to 6.61 tests per 1,000 people. And of course, in total number of tests, the US is probably 2.5 million now. This is a couple of days out of date. So the US has tested by far and away more individuals, representing 6.61 per 1,000 people in their population. Now we get on to the reason this is really interesting. Ecuador, Mesoamerica, 0.9% per 1,000. In other words, they've got virtually no idea how much infection is in their country. We'll come on to other examples of that. Australia is good, and the number of new cases in Australia are declining. So the combination of the targeted testing in Australia and the lockdown measures are working. The number of new cases in Australia, I didn't check it today already, but for the last few days it's been well on the way down, as indeed it has been in New Zealand. So that was encouraging as well. Now, moving on to Europe, Belgium, quite a long way behind Australia, 7.25 per 1,000. Austria, that should be the top of the next page. So that's Austria there. So Austria is 13.75 per 1,000, 120,000 in total. Czech Republic is doing quite well, 9.28 per 1,000. France, not doing well in testing at all, and the epidemic seems to be still, well, I think the numbers are starting to level off now in France, but they've got extreme lockdown measures, so they really need to up their game on testing in France. Now, this surprises me, to be fair. France is a very technologically, medically, biotechnologically advanced nation, so why France is so behind the curve on testing is a bit of a mystery. So if we compare that to Germany, look at Germany, it's about 5 times that of France. Germany's 15.97 tests per 1,000 of the population. Well over 1.3 million people tested. So Germany is doing very well there, and that's being reflected in the better figures from Germany. Greece, it's low. So again, what's happening in Greece? Iceland are quite pleased with themselves. They're top of the pile. But of course, it's a small country. It's an affluent country. It's an island. So it's not as surprising that they're getting on top of testing. Well, still not where it needs to be, of course. I mean, basically we need to test everyone, certainly for the antibody testing. Norway, also a rich, sophisticated country, good levels of testing. Southern Ireland, not quite so good, but the lockdown measures in Ireland were taken early, so the Irish aren't doing too badly. Sweden, well, we've mentioned Sweden a few times with their different approach, but the level of testing is relatively low. Switzerland is relatively high. Again, what we would expect from Switzerland, it's a isolated, advanced, well-off country. Turkey, low. Now, just look at this. India, 0.02 per 1,000. Pakistan, 0.17. So Pakistan a bit better. Now, they didn't have figures for Bangladesh. I think Bangladesh is slightly better because they've developed their own test. But India and Pakistan, what is going on in those countries? Well, basically, no one knows because the enemy is still invisible. Japan is astounding. One of the world's most advanced, sophisticated countries, and they're hardly testing at all. What is going on in Japan? Hardly any testing at all. Malaysia, not brilliant. There was big outbreaks in Malaysia in the early stages as well, of course, that we covered earlier on. Now, Philippines, tightly populated urban areas, 0.04 tests per 1,000. I am pessimistic, I am sad to say, about the Philippines. I expect there to be huge spread in the Philippines. Thailand, relatively poor levels of testing. Vietnam, poor. Senegal, going on to Africa. Senegal, again, very low levels of testing. Very worried about these areas in Africa. And then moving on to South Africa, again, relatively low levels, 0.97%. So again, the lockdown measures are violently, strictly enforced in South Africa, but still with these levels of testing, that gives grounds for pessimism. And then up at the other end of Africa, North Africa, Tunisia, also poor. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing variable levels of testing, often going with the wealth of the country and the sophistication of the country, but by no means exclusively so. Japan and France being disappointing. But we're seeing very low levels in poor countries, meaning that the pandemic in many poor countries is invisible, and I fear it is growing. So as we anticipated way back in January, there's going to be high levels of transmission and case fatality in many poorer areas. India, with extreme lockdown measures, is going to delay it, but really needs to up the testing. Now, the Indians can do this. Indian biomedicine is very sophisticated, and I'm sure they're working on it flat out at the moment. So there is hope there, but it could well be that the testing is going to come a bit late to stop significant spread. Let's just hope the lockdown measures are working. So what we need at the moment is these lockdown measures to suppress the pandemic from on top, but we also need these specific measures to pick away at it from the bottom, and that is testing. With the testing, we have an exit strategy while we wait for the vaccine.